Welcome back. In our last session, I introduced the idea that a wilderness experience is actually part of God's divine discipleship plan for anybody who would seek to be a follower. And rather than us fear a wilderness, I actually want us to see that wilderness is an experience that's dripping with potential and dripping with richness that can really empower our lives. And what we're going through with this pandemic is actually a form of wilderness, and I don't know how you're feeling with that. Maybe this wilderness doesn't feel very nice to you. Maybe you've been suffering with your health. Maybe you're struggling with the effects of COVID. Maybe you've unfortunately lost loved ones. You've experienced bereavement. Maybe you've lost a job. Your income's been affected. You're struggling to put food on the table. These are all very real experiences. And in looking at wildernesses, I do not want to minimise at all the impact and the very real impact that COVID is having. However, I want us to maybe ask the question that even though it's a time of struggle, perhaps it's something that God wants to take you through, take me through, take us through, to help us become the people He wants us to be. And why do I say that? Well, actually, I believe wildernesses are a biblical theme, and I believe that the heroes that we read about in the Bible all had wilderness experiences. So let me take you on a whistle-stop tour. Let's begin in Genesis with Noah. Noah, did he have a wilderness experience? Well, he spent 40 days and nights in an ark, floating on the waters where the rain came down for 40 days and 40 nights, and they survived. I want to suggest to you, Noah had a wilderness experience in the ark. There was a sense of God destroying the sinfulness and starting a new covenant, a new relationship. Part of that wilderness experience for Noah. What about Joseph? Well, when we begin to meet Joseph, we see that he's sent into the wilderness to go and visit his brothers who are tending their sheep in the wilderness. And when his brothers see him coming and they make the plot to kill him, and Reuben steps in and they throw him into a cistern, a dried up well, that's in the wilderness. And Joseph gets sent off into Egypt where he's falsely accused of rape, and he ends up spending years and years in prison until miraculously he's promoted to the role of Prime Minister. Joseph's journey began in the wilderness, and he went through many years of a wilderness experience before he moved into his destiny as Prime Minister. What about Moses? Moses is born into a nation that's in slavery in Egypt, and he's discovered in this basket in the bulrushes by Pharaoh's daughter, and he's brought up by Pharaoh's daughter. But he then has this moment where he murders somebody. Where does Moses run? But he runs into the wilderness. And Moses spends the next 40 years in the wilderness tending his the sheep of who becomes his father-in-law. And he's in the wilderness when he then, after 40 years, encounters the burning bush and is called back to go back to see Pharaoh and to say, let my people go. They go through the plagues, and he then rescues the nation and he leads them out. Where does he lead them? He leads them out of Egypt into the wilderness. And they go through the Red Sea into the wilderness. And rather than go straight up north to the promised land, they actually take a detour south through the desert, through the wilderness, through that sort of wilderness experience. God leads them in there, and that's a whole other story of why all of that happens. Perhaps it was because they weren't ready as a nation to face some of the enemies they would, so they get led on a safer journey through the wilderness. But whatever happens, they take this journey into the wilderness, and they end up spending 40 years wandering in the wilderness because of their rebellion against God. And before they go into the promised land, they have this wilderness experience. Joshua, Moses' assistant, he spends his formative years growing up under Moses' leadership in the wilderness. He comes out of Egypt, he's part of the family that comes out of Egypt, he's Moses' assistant, and he spends this time in the tent in the wilderness. He's one of the spies who goes in to spy out the promised land and comes back with the message of this fruitful land. But his formative years are spent in the wilderness. David, where was David when we first meet him? He was tending his sheep in the wilderness. He was a shepherd in the wilderness. And when we then meet him, he's going to see his brothers who are facing Goliath. And his brothers say to him, "Did you leave those sheep of yours in the wilderness?" So the wilderness shapes David's character before he encounters Goliath. And then when David then becomes this mighty warrior, he then comes into conflict with King Saul. Where does David run? He runs into the wilderness. He goes into the wilderness as a place of his stronghold where he develops and becomes king. We then have Elijah, who we're going to be spending time looking at. Elijah, at the very start of his story, confronts King Ahab, tells him there's going to be no rain, and then goes into the wilderness. He goes to the Kerith Brook, where he's fed by ravens who bring him bread and meat, and he drinks from the water until it dries up, and he goes to a widow in Zarephath who looks after him. And it's in the wilderness that Elijah learns to trust God. After his encounter with the priests of Baal on Mount Carmel, and he sees fire come from heaven and it's this incredible victory, he then has his life threatened. And where does Elijah go? He runs into the wilderness. He runs into a place of familiarity to escape. Roll it forward, Jesus. Jesus, when he begins his ministry, he gets baptized, and the first thing that Jesus does is he goes into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. So Jesus goes in there and prepares before he begins his ministry. I hope what you see from this is that all these heroes of the faith, people who we look at, who we might aspire to, who we can learn, who we study, who God's given us their examples to teach us more about him, all of them had wilderness experiences. And it seems almost as if before they can move into their destiny, they need the wilderness. The wilderness is part of that formative shaping experience. What about you? Do you fear the wilderness? Do you wonder why you're in a wilderness? Maybe, just maybe, it's because God's beginning to do something amazing in your life.